So this presentation is also talking about informal fallacies again, just like the last one. And so I've got the slide up again just to kind of remind us what an informal fallacy is. It's an error in reasoning that doesn't have anything to do with the form, the structure of the argument itself. Something else has gone wrong with the argument. It's probably the content of the argument is off somehow, or it's just a weird argument, and so it's not acceptable. We went through some of these last time, so I'll jump forward here all the way to here. Think about fallacies involving ambiguity. And so this is sort of a callback to chapter 3 a little bit. We talked about this. So a term is ambiguous when there's more than one distinct meaning for that term. And then it just in general, this idea of ambiguity can be applied to more than just individual terms, as we'll see. But first up is something that we did talk about in chapter 3 on definitions, which is equivocation. This is when our intended meaning for a term changes partway through the argument that we're presenting. So if we're going to change meanings, we need to change terms, right? We can't use the same word for different ideas, different intended meanings in different places throughout the argument. So here's sort of the example that I had back there in chapter 3. It's a dumb argument, but it's a dumb argument because it equivocates, right? So Jim increased the volume of air in his lungs, so therefore Jim made the air in his lungs louder. So this is a clear equivocation on the term volume. In the premise there, volume means his lung capacity, right? The space that's inside of his lungs. Whereas the conclusion is using volume to mean loudness or quietness, right? Like it's a matter of it has to do with the sound. And so that's different meaning of the term volume. And so the argument is dumb, right? It just doesn't work. So here's another one that doesn't involve an individual term. Instead, it's something about the grammatical structure of a sentence that has more than one interpretation. The meaning of the sentence, the proposition that is the cognitive meaning of the sentence is open to interpretation, right? There's different ways of interpreting that. So it's ambiguous sentence structure. Even if the individual terms in that sentence don't change. And very often this is used to humorous effect, right? People will intentionally misinterpret a sentence in order to make a joke. It's sort of like dad humor or whatnot, but I think it's funny. So I've got a bunch of examples here. So tuna are biting off the coast of Florida. Like, okay, so it should be clear that the intended meaning there is that for people that want to go fishing, where they want to catch some tuna, and now you're giving them advice as to where to go, right? Go to Florida, start fishing off the coast there, and some tuna will bite your bait on the end of your line. So that's what's really clearly the intended meaning there. But notice that without changing the structure of the argument really at all, or the structure of the sentence, this could mean something different. It could mean that the tuna are actually taking chunks out of the coast of Florida with their mouths, right? They're biting the coast of Florida and taking it away, right? They're biting off the coast of Florida. That's a potential interpretation of this sentence. It's a silly interpretation meant for humorous effect, but nevertheless, it is a possible interpretation here. This next one is actually from Groucho Marx. He was sort of a famous movie comedian from long ago. He had one of the original sort of talk shows. He said, one morning I shot an elephant in my pajamas. And then he goes on to say how it got into my pajamas, I'll never know, right? And that's the joke, right? That intentionally misinterpreting this sentence. So the more straightforward interpretation is that one morning I was wearing my pajamas, and then for whatever reason I shot an elephant. But it's an open interpretation to think that the elephant was in my pajamas, right? The elephant was wearing my pajamas, and then I shot the elephant. So anyway, silly humor, but nevertheless, that's the way it is. So I can't help it. Here's a couple more. This one's not so much of a joke. It really is sort of open to different interpretations, and they both seem pretty legitimate. So I was thinking about that pub we went to many times. So does this mean that I was thinking many times about that pub? Or I was thinking maybe just right now, this is the single time, I was thinking about a pub that we used to go to all the time, right? That we went to frequently. So that's different possible interpretations of the sentence. Both of them are pretty legitimate. And so if you were to use this as the premise of an argument, you would need to make it clear which interpretation is the one that you intend. This next one, well, yeah, the intended meaning hopefully is clear, but then there's like a bizarre sort of alternative meaning, right? Did you ever talk about sex with your parents? So presumably this is thinking about like when you were going through puberty, did your parents sit you down to have the sex talk and tell you about what sex is and so on? And hopefully this doesn't mean that you're talking about like an instance of having sex with your parents and now you're talking about that event. Right? It's like, that's sort of the weird one, right? We hope that's not what you mean. But just given the sentence structure as it is, that's a legitimate potential interpretation here. And so usually these amphiboles can be fixed with more careful phrasing of the sentence, right? So that first one, like, I've been thinking many times about that pub we used to go to all the time, right? The pub we used to frequent. So, you know, it doesn't take a whole lot of work to clarify which of the possible meanings you actually intend with a given statement. Okay, moving on. So here's another fallacy of ambiguity. This is a real famous one, the fallacy of composition. And this is where the property of a part, so some whole thing, it's made of individual parts, and you take a property of the part and you inappropriately apply that to the whole, right? So here's one example, right? Every inch from here to the moon is a short distance, so therefore the whole distance from here to the moon is very short. Like, well, that's obviously silly, right? That's obviously a fallacy. Or we might say, you know, we've got some really heavy object. We say, well, each individual part of that object weighs less than a pound, so therefore the whole object weighs less than a pound. Like, well, that's obviously improper application of the property of the parts to the whole. But that only when it's improper, right? It's not every time that we apply properties of the parts to the whole that it's improper. So if we're talking about the material composition of some whole thing, some large object, then it could be appropriate. So for example, I might say every part of this object is made of iron, so therefore the whole object is made of iron. Like, well, that's appropriate, right? If every part of it is made of iron, then the whole thing is iron. So that's not a fallacy. That's accuracy. So we do have to be a little careful with that. So here's another example of a fallacious use of composition, right? So each individual player on the team is outstanding, so therefore the team is outstanding. Well, maybe not, right? You know, so very often an all-star team might not actually be a very good team, right? Each individual player is an all-star, so they're an outstanding player. Maybe they're right near the top in the world in this sport. But, you know, sometimes when you get these superstars together on a team, they just don't work together. The pieces don't mesh together properly, and they end up being really not that great of a team, right? So it's improper to assume that just because each individual player is outstanding, that the team must be outstanding. Okay, going the other direction is also a problem. So a fallacy of division, that's inappropriately applying a property of the whole thing to an individual part of the thing. So, you know, we might say like this, we look at a house, it's all made of stone, and we say, oh, the stone has vaulted ceilings. So therefore, each individual stone that makes up the house has vaulted ceilings. Like, well, that's obviously silly, right? An individual stone doesn't even have a ceiling, much less a vaulted ceiling, even though the structure that's been built using these stones might have a ceiling and a vaulted ceiling. So this is an inappropriate application of a property of the whole to the individual parts of that whole. We can also use the outstanding team example here. So the team is outstanding. Therefore, each individual player on the team is outstanding. Well, that's not necessarily true. You can get a really good team that's made up of players that aren't all-stars, right? Yeah, probably they're going to be at least pretty good in order for the team to be good. But as long as the players sort of mesh together and they've got a really good plan, they're very well coordinated together, they've got good plays, they practice really hard and consistently and so on, they can be an outstanding team, even when each individual player on that team isn't necessarily all that outstanding. Okay, so that's all the fallacies of ambiguity that we've got here. And so I'll go ahead and stop there.